Hello, welcome everyone to this webinar on fair data organized by the NVO, the Dutch Research Council. We are live today from the NVO studio in The Hague in the Netherlands. We have three guests here with me in the studio and two guest speakers joining us online from the UK and the US. Welcome everyone, thank you for joining us. I am Maria Cruz. I am a policy advisor at NVO. I work on open science policies and I'm the contact person and the coordinator for the research data management policy of NVO. Today, we will have a keynote speaker followed by a panel discussion. And after that, if you have the chance, you're very welcome to join us for a networking event, informal networking with with speed dating. And more details follow on that later. Thank you again for joining us. This webinar marks the 5th anniversary of the NVO Research Data Management Policy. NVO, the Dutch Research Council, is the main funding agency in the Netherlands. 5 years ago, we introduced our data management policy. Research data funded by NVO must be as open as possible, closed if necessary, and fair. That is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. A couple of days ago, I was asked by colleagues from the Swedish Research Council what we have learned here at NVO from 5 years since the implementation of our research data management policy. I think what the most important thing we learned is that it does take a village. NVO, RDM, research data management, and FAIR is a shared responsibility. Researchers in receipt of funding from NVO must make their data available and comply with our policies. And we know that they do so with the help and support from data stewards and research support staff at their home institutions. And I know a lot of you are here today attending, and thank you everyone. Thank you data stewards, thank you RDM support staff at Dutch public research institutions for supporting our grantees with data management. We also know that the researchers, they rely on services and infrastructure, such as data repositories and web tools, such as DMP tools. 5 years on from the introduction of our policy, which is also 5 years since the publication of the FAIR principles, we are looking today in this webinar at the roles and responsibilities of FAIR. And who better to start us off than Sarah Jones, our guest speaker here in the studio with us. Sarah Jones is the EOSC engagement manager at GEANT and one of the directors of the EOSC Association. And EOSC is, of course, the European Open Science Cloud. Previously, Sarah worked at the Digital Curation Center in Scotland, where she led the DMP online service. Sarah, where next with FAIR?
Maria, and thank you all of you for attending. It's really good to see so many of you showing up today. So I've been asked to give a few reflections just before we move into the panel to talk about where we're going next with FAIR. And the first thing I wanted to do is just to give a huge congratulations to NWO. I think it's fantastic to see how the policy's developed and how it's been implemented by all the different institutions in the Netherlands. And as Maria said, that's something that really takes a village. You know, it's not just the funder to release the policy, it's also making sure that there is appropriate support on the ground through the data stewards and through all the different infrastructures and services that are available. And I think it's great to see how well that policy's been taken up and also how it's influenced other funders in the network too. So my challenge today is really to think about where we're going with FAIR. I think the concept is very well known. People are familiar with the principles and that they're really there to help make sure that the content that we make available is reusable by humans and machines. So we want to be able to do the most with the data that's been made available. But how do we turn those set of principles into practices? And how do we support research communities with that? And one of the things I would encourage is that we actually act as a very broad church, as a big community together. So I think FAIR has a lot of traction, and you'll see a lot of people engaging in FAIR and advocating for FAIR. But there are parallel communities as well, looking at things like open science and also data management. And I think it's important that we come together as one big community to really advocate for all of these things. The concepts are slightly different. You'll already have heard many times that, FAIR doesn't mean open. We can make sensitive data FAIR and make it available to others. It doesn't need to be under an open license. And I think the arguments we make with research communities when we're doing this advocacy can be a little bit different with each of these concepts. Openness and FAIR are really about the sharing of content with others. So it's very much for that external community benefit. It's for making sure others can kind of get the rewards from that data and see those wider collaborations happening. Whereas data management is actually something that's very useful to research groups themselves and make sure that they can find and retrieve their own content in future research that they're doing. But across all of these areas, we're needing to make sure that there's support in place. And there's a very big community of data management specialists, data stewards, lab managers, software engineers that help in all of these aspects. And I think we need to work together across those different concepts. And one of the reasons I mention that is because some of the things aren't explicit in FAIR. So data management per se isn't really covered by FAIR, but a lot of the decisions that researchers are making early on about what file formats to use, what standards are appropriate, will really affect the fairness of the data later on. And obviously how they document and version and store that data appropriately enables us to make sure we can show the provenance, we can show why that data was created, for what purpose, how it's been processed. And ethics is another concept that doesn't really come up explicitly in FAIR, but is really important, particularly when we're working with human subject data. So we need to make sure we're storing the data appropriately, we have the right consents, we're making sure it's only shared with relevant people. Data quality also doesn't come up explicitly in FAIR, but I think it's something that's really important for the reuse of data. We need to make sure that it's accurate, that it's reliable, that we've got a full set of data and that others can trust in that. And similarly, the preservation doesn't come up explicitly in FAIR, but we want to make sure that that data endures and is in trusted repositories. And when studies have been done actually about repository infrastructures, we've found that those repositories that have certifications often score more highly in terms of making content fair and available too. So we want to make sure that content is available in the long term. One of the other aspects that I think is important to touch on is that FAIR is a joint responsibility. And I think this will come out quite a lot in the panel discussion today, because it's really about all of those different communities coming together to support researchers. If we want to make the data fair, we need the services that enable that as well. And that's the repository services, but also all of that data stewardship and support that happens alongside the researchers. And in a previous conference, I'd done this mapping of the different roles in implementing FAIR. And when you look at the different principles, obviously there are joint responsibilities between researchers and services, but actually a lot of the responsibility falls on the services more than the researchers. When we're looking to assign persistent identifiers, for example, it's the repository service that will do that. So the role of the researcher is knowing which services to use and knowing which standards to adopt. And again, they often need support and direction from the support teams in the institutions with that. So to pick up on the researcher roles, obviously researchers are needing to adopt relevant standards as they create data. And I think there's a really key role for research communities in developing these standards as well, and trying to make sure that that's something that is recognized as well for those communities. So they start to get rewards for actually investing time in that as well as doing the research. Making sure that the data has rich metadata and documentation. so that it is reusable by others. It's clear how it's licensed, who can use that data, and that we're linking together all of the different outputs of research, all of the code and the associated resources needed to replicate those research results. And the key thing for researchers is knowing the appropriate data services to use. And I think this is a really key area where the different services come in to help direct them to those appropriate services. Within the institutions, there's a big need to raise awareness of those community standards and to help researchers select the appropriate data services. So having good signposting of what's available, either through the institution or through the different thematic services from the different research domains. Many institutions are running their own repositories, so there are certifications you can do to see how fair your repository is, but making sure that you're following those principles, you're assigning the identifiers, you're making sure that the metadata specifies the identifier, making that data harvestable so that it can be exposed in other contexts. So for example, in EOS, the area I'm working in, we're pulling information from different repositories so that data is more discoverable across the European community. And I think one of the key things for institutions as well is making sure there is local support. And Maria touched on the importance of this and how much that's happening in the Dutch context. And one thing I think we'll pick up on in the panel is this kind of team science approach, trying to recognize all of the different roles in conducting the research and supporting those outputs. So the kind of software engineering roles, the data stewardship, all of the data processing work that goes on, as well as the kind of core research. And there's a big role for funders as well. And it's really good to see that the NWO haven't just had a policy. They're not just requiring fair and being as open as possible, but they're providing all the support infrastructure that's needed too. So they're offering services, as Maria mentioned, like DMP Online. They're supporting data stewards, either through the funds within the different grant applications or the competency centers that are being set up here in the Netherlands. And I think NWO has also been a real innovator in terms of the funding schemes that it has. So recently they've had an open science fund, which was looking at some of the specific gaps that are in place. So having the relevant standards for the different research communities, extending the tools to make sure that the data can be made available in a machine actionable way, and also building the recognition and rewards that are needed to incentivize researchers to engage in open science. NWO has also had a big influence, not just on the institutions in the Netherlands, but also other funders. They've been sharing their practice in the different research funder groups and have influenced the Science Europe policy and other funder programs too. And I think that's really good to see. Just to come towards a close for me, I wanted to touch on some of the kind of challenges that remain, and we'll pick up on more of those in the panel too. I think one obvious one is that communities are at very different stages of maturity. Some, like astronomy, are very well organized. They have their international virtual observatory with all of their different standards so that they can share the data across their field, but also with parallel domains. And they've also been working to expose their data through the EOSC, through services like B2 Share, so that that content's accessible and reusable by others. But in many other communities, there's still a need to develop standards, which is why things like the Open Science Fund are very important. And there have been a number of studies, actually Marta was involved in one of these studies, the 6 recommendations for implementation of fair practice, which showed that it's really important to develop a culture for fair. That if we want to try and help communities to engage, we really need to make sure there is the support and also the recognition of those practices. And to move on to that, I think actually the recognition and rewards is one of the biggest barriers we still face. You know, we have the policies, we have support in place, but often researchers don't get credit for making their content openly available, for making it fair. And that's something that we need to build into the kind of funding programs, the ways that we're deciding how to allocate funds or how to promote people within institutions, we want to start to recognize people for these practices because it's quite a lot of effort and it needs a lot of collaboration. So we need to start incentivizing that as well. And a final point I wanted to make is that we're all using the FAIR principles a lot in many different contexts within our policies, within the metrics that we're applying to assess digital objects, and also in certification schemes for the different services we run. And I think that needs a kind of responsibility on all of us to manage and govern the FAIR principles as well. And this was a question we asked at the EOS symposium about whether the principles need to be governed. There was a broad agreement that they do. And when we talked about how we should be doing that, there was a desire to do this in an international community group because the FAIR principles have been picked up all around the world, and it's something that we need to manage together because we're becoming very dependent on them in the way that we're starting to assess and kind of track research. So that's a few opening questions, opening statements from me. I'm happy to take questions if there are any that have come in the chat. But I also would like to turn to the panel. We have 4 panelists with us today, 2 here in the studio, Marta and Antica, and 2 remotely, Chris and Lauren. And we're going to put a series of questions to them. I've listed some of them here, but we also want to hear your views from the audience as well. And Maria's going to feed questions to me on the iPad here so I can bring in your questions as we go through the discussion. So I think what I'll do is actually start with the first question to the panel about the biggest bugbear each panelist has faced individually in implementing FAIR. And I'll come first to Marta. So I don't know if you'd like to introduce yourself and your role, the work you do at Delft, and then reflect on your biggest bugbear.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Marta Teperek, and I'm the head of research data services at TU Delft. And as such, I oversee various, as you said, Sarah, support services that we offer to researchers. And we have also been recently have received some funding from NVO, which help us establish a digital competence center where we indeed hire people who support researchers with doing FAIR data. And in terms of the biggest bugbear, so thanks so much, Sarah, for your slides, which I think you introduced some of the concepts in there. I think my biggest bugbear is indeed the team science. How do we really put team science concepts into practice? Even more importantly, how do we change the mindset that we have, the recognition that team science, like having people that bring different skills to the team, is actually much more effective at addressing societal challenges. And here I don't only mean researchers from different disciplines working in cross-disciplinary setting, but I also mean different kinds of professionals. So exactly as you have mentioned, Sarah, for example, research software engineers, data managers, data stewards, lab managers, community managers as well, different kinds of people, project managers, perhaps. And, I'm also wondering, how do we change this recognition? And one of that is by example. At TU Delft, with the funding we have received from NVO, we were able to start a digital competence center, which offers researchers the opportunity to receive support of data managers, research software engineers who join them in the project for up to 6 months. And it gives this recognition that indeed by having this expert support staff, so far the feedback has been very positive. They understand the added value of this professional staff. However, I do wonder, does it scale? Is that good enough? What do other people think? So that's one of my big questions. And once we have changed the recognition that people indeed see the value of different kinds of professionals and different kinds of skill sets within the team, then how do we train those professionals? Where do they come from? How do we fund them sustainably? Exactly the questions that you have asked. And how do we reward them? Because indeed, I think that recognition and rewarding people for their work is really key. And I think in here, my last bugbear related to that is, wherever you would look at all those different infrastructure, tools, solutions, I think in the end, what you see is people who really contribute to change, who drive that cultural change. And even in infrastructures, when you look about this, if you would have just infrastructures without the people supporting that, driving researchers towards the adoption, in the end, that would be very difficult to make it attractive to researchers, to bring the community together. So first of all, I would like to have more recognition that it costs money, because indeed people, that costs money. We have to employ those people, we have to sustain them, and we have to recognize. So I think these are my two biggest bugbear, how do we put team science in practice, and how do we recognize that it involves a strategic investment from the funders, from research institutions, and recognition in the long term.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Marta. Yeah, I think that human dimension is really important. So having people collaborating together, and I like that model of being able to embed data stewards or software engineers for a certain time with the research group. I think that's actually been picked up in other institutions like in Melbourne as well. And there is a question about the scalability. How do you enable that?
Precisely.
Because all the groups need this kind of support. And without, dedicated staffing in place, it's very difficult to roll that out. So yeah, I think those funding questions are a big blocker, and something that there's a question how we do it through research funders, through the allocation on grants, and also through the institutional investment. Thank you. So Antica, if I come to you next.
Yeah, so I'm an evolutionary ecologist by training, and then somehow through my career after PhD, and maybe at the end of PhD, I drifted towards open science, and then I'm slowly drifting towards meta science, which incorporates a lot of open science, because if we want to support open science principles, we also want to see if they really make a difference for a research that we can get out and the quality of that research. I also started during this whole process database and network for a certain sub-community within ecological community. So these people work on birds, where we're trying to make data fair. So maybe when talking about these bugbears, I'll just take my messages from and learnings from starting up this community, because this is a real researchers. We are trying to do something with not much funding, without recognition in a sense of classical research recognition that counts for your further career advancement. And also because it does bring community of researchers together. And what I found interesting there is that I changed my opinion from really thinking we have to force open and fair towards we actually need to understand that people come from different perspectives. And even within Europe, European Union, the researchers in different countries are facing different environment. That means that making fair, it's not fair for everybody, or it's not equally difficult or easy for all research groups. And I think this is something that we need to recognize. So if we are setting some common, for example, ways to measure success, because I think that's really important in supporting fairness and openness, we also need to look into these kind of individual cases, disciplines, individual countries, especially because we move between countries. So then if I produce something here, which might be valued, maybe in my home country is not going to be. So I think this is something important when we think of fair, how fair it is to everybody that we want to involve. And second, maybe this is not a bugbear with fair, but I think it's a positive thing of fair. I find it more easy to talk about fair than about open with researchers, because they are happy with fair. They like it. They want their data to be, well cleaned, and proper and easier to use, but they often don't want to make them open. So I also feel that fair is kind of easier concept to push through, and it's also important because you can always later on make data open once they are fair, but you can make data open which are not fair and then they're useless. So my biggest things are basically lack of funds and some kind of thinking more about individual communities and individual countries that are within big fair landscape.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much. And I see kind of agreement from Marta as well, and similar experiences in trying to advocate for open and fair, and that fair is an easier concept in many senses. So I'll move to the remote panelists now as well. So Lauren, would you like to come in next, introduce yourself and talk about your bugbear?
Sure, thanks, Sarah. I'm Lauren Cadwallader. I'm the Open Research Manager at PLOS. So I work across a suite of PLOS journals, trying to improve our open science services and policies and how we can help enable authors create and share their research in an open and transparent way. And I primarily deal with data and code. My bugbear with FAIR, I guess a concern with how we often approach FAIR is that perhaps we sometimes oversimplify the FAIR principles. You know, there's common consensus that the findable and accessible portions of FAIR are fairly straightforward to deal with. But things like interoperability are much harder. And whilst simplifying the FAIR principles for researchers can be beneficial in terms of getting people to start interacting with FAIR principles and thinking about how to make their data fair, I do worry that it introduces an element of complacency and that we don't push researchers further forwards into making their research fair, so that they think, okay, yeah, tick, I've got a DOI, I've put in metadata, but they haven't really thought about the interoperability side of things, or perhaps the reusability, so they're not maximizing the fairness of their data. And I think it's important that we do, bring researchers on board with the easy sides of FAIR, but actually we do keep pushing them forwards, because that's the only way I think that we're really going to kind of make research data fair on a larger scale, as if we keep driving forward these principles. I think, excellent. I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah. I was actually wondering about asking a follow-up question. This is maybe a little bit cheeky of me, but do you have any examples of ways that we can do that? Because I agree with you completely. I think we often simplify, we focus on the findable and accessible because it's the easy thing, deposit your data, get a persistent identifier, have the metadata harvestable, and it's things that we can easily do through repository services. But as you said, it's that interoperability and reuse. It's the community standards. It's making that metadata available in a machine readable way, and the use of controlled vocabularies. And actually, one thing that came out, a couple of us were involved in the Open Science Fund here and the reviews of those projects. And many of them were around tools to actually improve the practice there, to make it easier for that content to be harvestable and to be used by machines. And I wondered if you have examples of how we can really try and make more progress on those interoperability and reuse angles as well.
I think it comes back to what you were saying earlier about those things around data management that aren't explicitly mentioned in FAIR, but are really important. So that kind of data management, data quality, and what Marta was saying about the kind of support and learning around data and fairness, that if we can really embed that from early on, we can start educating researchers around interoperability. So we ensure that they use the systems that will result in interoperable data at the end, and that we can teach data literacy skills to not just postgraduates, but undergraduates as well, so that they enter their higher education really aware of the issues around data interoperability and the fairness of it, so that they can go through their kind of academic learning and potential research careers really understanding the need for that interoperability and for those kind of machine readable embedded elements of FAIR data.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lauren. And finally, I'll come to Chris Erdmann, who's over in the States. Hopefully it's not too early in the day for you, Chris. So if you could just introduce yourself and your role at AGU and your biggest bugbear with FAIR.
Yeah, and thank you again for the invitation. And I was taking notes from all of you to see if I could speak to some of these things. But to start, yeah, I'm in the data leadership group at the American Geophysical Union. And to start, it's funny how to describe it this way, but we cover everything from the inner core of the planet to the planets, and everything in between. And so we have 22 journals, other things that we're working on as far as community science and policy. But my particular area, data leadership, I work with my colleague Shelley Stahl, and I'm specifically, my title is the assistant director, but I do a lot of data stewardship work. And so actually I was just thinking, it would be great to have a data stewardship session of all the things I'm seeing through the desk, the help desk at the AGU. There's a tremendous amount to learn and share with our community. And so I guess I'll start with FAIR and what we were talking about, how it's easy to communicate with the researchers. I see a lot of that through our help desk, that they often say, I completely agree with FAIR, but then we have these data stewardship, sort of underlying questions of what that means. And I think that's that richness, that value that we can bring back with other data stewards, is talk about how we can sort of fix these things, how we can work together to improve them. The other thing is, we talked about what we often hear is community standards, right? Well, I use community standards, and when you delve into that, people say, well, I use community standards, and it gets into this question of, that's a good question. What does that mean? And I think that's one of the things that we're looking at in AGU, is leveraging all those particular sections, those domains of talking about what that means actually with researchers. I think it's like the rubber hits the road, as we say in the US. It's like just trying to get to what does that actually mean, and simplify, like take a checklist approach to what they might need to know. There's this other conversation about funders, and one of the things we like to think about, and we'll have conversations with the funders as well about this, is the outcomes, taking a sort of outcomes approach, to how they see things initially. So I think, data management plan has been something they have to do, but then sort of seeing the value of like putting that together and the outcomes later on. And credit is something we've worked at AGU to really ensure that data citations, software citations are working, so that you can see it throughout the scholarly system. And that truly has taken a village of people to work on. And I think that maybe the last thing that my bugbear is, and I work on data stewardship, right? And my biggest bugbear is that I think we haven't realized linked science, right? Linking all these resources. I think at the end of the day, that's where a lot of my conversations happen, which is, you can deposit here and you can do that, deposit your software, deposit your data, deposit your notebook, so someone can sort of rerun some of your analysis. And so we have a lot of conversations around those outcomes and linking to them. And I think that's one of the things that we see that we could do more upfront, right? And working with universities, working with organizations, is that sort of upfront training of saying, hey, you might want to talk to your repository upfront to understand how you structure your data later on when you share it. And I think another thing just to mention too is that we do work with our community now. Like, we're very transparent and working in the open on our guidance and training. So we work with actually early career researchers, senior researchers, in developing the data and software guidance that we're working on. But I think, again, the biggest bugbear is that sort of linked science. And I think it speaks to, some of the things that have been being said, especially to that team science approach of how do we sort of, recognize the contributions of others. So
yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris. And as you said, I think it's quite a hard landscape to navigate. There's so many different services, so many different standards. So trying to signpost researchers to the relevant services can be difficult, and also linking those all together. There was a question that had come in on the chat that was about, as research support staff, how might we best support or advise researchers on different community standards, especially when we're engaging in multi or cross-domain support? And I don't know if that's one that you'd wanted to take, Chris, or I can also throw it out to the panel here.
Yeah, I briefly spoke to it, actually. It's leveraging our sections in the AGU, and one of the places we wanted to start with was hydrology, to really sort of understand how we could sort of look at those, unpacking what community standards, the things that they can do up front to help with, various aspects of communicating their research. And so I spoke to that earlier.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris. So the next question we want to come to is the kind of issues we still face in implementing FAIR. And maybe I'll take a slightly different order and come to Lauren first.
Sure, I was just going to share some of my experiences from working at a publisher, but also my kind of previous role running an institutional repository supporting data sharing that way. And what I was really thinking about when I think about my past experiences were the kind of the points, I guess, in the research life cycle that we suddenly start focusing on FAIR. So as someone who's trying to facilitate data sharing via a repository, or someone who's trying to implement a journal policy, I see a lot of emphasis around the kind of the published data set at the time of publication. Is that data FAIR? And I feel that that's often quite a tense or maybe stressful point in the research journey for a researcher. They're trying to get their paper published, and we know that a lot of judgment is made on the researchers about their published output, and we don't necessarily have to agree with that being the best mode of assessment, but actually that's the system that is operating to a large degree. And so I think we really need to think about when and how we communicate with the researchers, because as someone who's trying to facilitate data sharing, I don't want to suddenly hold up what is the kind of endpoint of maybe several years' work when they're trying to publish their paper by saying, actually, your data is not fair. Could you go back and do a lot of work to try and improve that? And then we can share your data and then we can publish your paper. I think we really need to start thinking about that kind of research life cycle more holistically and where the FAIR principles fit into that. And I know, great work is being done with data stewards and trying to implement support earlier on. But I do think there has tended to be a kind of a lot of focus at perhaps assessing FAIR at that point as a single point of assessment, or perhaps as a point of compliance that perhaps isn't the best way to look at the fairness of data, or the best time to look at the fairness of data.
Yeah, a lot of the things that happen early on really impact it. So I think trying to get that support in earlier is really important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe Antica would also like to reflect on this question. So I know you've got a lot of research experience in building different data sets. So maybe the kind of issues you found in implementing FAIR.
Yeah, I think, maybe I can speak in more general kind of way, because I think main pillars are there for implementing FAIR, but they still need to be adjusted to community-specific examples, as I mentioned. And B, I think they need to go a bit more broad. And one thing that's lacking, it's actually all under one term, and it's support. But that means education. That means finances, which includes also human resources, let's say somebody who's going to help you in implementing FAIR. And third, recognition. So from a researcher perspective, we are trained in statistics to a certain level, and then if I need helps with some more difficult models, I'm going to a statistician. But we are not trained in FAIR. So even asking help is difficult because we don't have, I do, but the average researcher doesn't have a clue where to even start. So we need to support researcher by training them within their education from undergrad on that this is part of the science and you need to know some basics in order to ask for help. Then the second, obviously, financial support. So with Spybirds, for example, we have now a community. We are managing quite well, but we still need money to be able to implement everything that we want to implement. Even having a data steward, who would help that? I know we talk a lot about data stewards, but the reality is that data stewards don't exist in many of the institutes, at least not at the quantity they should exist. And the third is metrics, or how we measure the success of researcher, because I'm well aware that the majority of us would say, well, if I'm putting a lot of effort into making my data fair, which I don't have any support for, it takes a lot of time, I'm losing what I measured by, and that's my publication. So I really believe we need to change incentives in science in order to push forward a new way of doing science and not just and only publishing a paper in a high impact journal, which I know that change, it is there, but it's still not there.
Yeah, so no, it's a very slow change. Yeah. And there's a question that's come in from the audience as well to Marta, saying that you rightly emphasize the importance of recognition and rewards to foster fair and team science, but they're wondering how you look at the strong divide between support staff and researchers, at least in the Dutch academic community.
That's a very good question, Sarah. Indeed, I think that a divide is problematic. And I think indeed, if we are to fully embrace that concept of team science, we have to address and, in my opinion, challenge this divide. Do we still need this divide? Or perhaps there are more opportunities if this divide was not there. Of course, people will be still responsible for their roles and what their tasks are. That doesn't go away. I don't mean that. But what I mean is indeed, we shouldn't be classifying ourselves into the silos. There are so many occasions that myself, my primary role is to support researchers in research data management. But how wonderful would it be that if for certain aspects of my role, I could get extra support, dedicated support of a researcher, for example, a qualified social scientist, to help me understand what are the barriers that prevent researchers from making their data fair. Wouldn't my support services be better? And on the other hand, we already spoke about this, researchers, they really need support of professionals. I believe, when you look at the task of a researcher, and Antica, you probably can comment on that better, but when I think about how much pressure there is, to do research, first of all, to publish, to do teaching, to supervise students and people in the group, to then also do fair data, go to conferences, manage your software. It just becomes a really, I think, unmanageable job. So wouldn't we do better indeed if, for whatever aspects of this job, instead of doing everything on your own, you could hire a dedicated professional with skills on data management, research software engineering, lab management, for example, to do this work much better, and then it's off your plate. So, but I agree with you with that, whoever asked the question. I think it's a very important question at the moment. There are multiple obstacles created because of this divide. The first one from simple visa issues, which there are different criteria for support staff and researchers, all the way up to ability to apply for grants or write papers. We have all those silos, and I don't think that universities in the 21st century need those silos. I think we could do better. There are more opportunities if we remove them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's nice to think about it as that two-way street as well, how you can bring the research skills into some of the support roles and kind of advance how well those are being delivered.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Excellent. There was another question that had come in actually asking the panel whether we believe we need to teach researchers how to make their data machine readable, or do we need to teach data stewards and other support staff how to do this? So whose responsibility is it really to think about those technical aspects, how we make the content machine readable? I don't know if either of you here would like to pick up on that, or I'll also throw it out to Chris and Lauren.
Well, I think I already kind of mentioned that, and I think it's two-way street.
Yeah.
So we need to be trained a bit better in research data management and in fair data and fair software. But obviously, this is not going to be main part of our work.
Yeah.
So we are trained as biologists, ecologists, whoever we are, but we have this component of the training to enable us to understand what we need to achieve with our data and to be able to communicate our needs to a person who is educated to be data steward, for example, or a software manager. And these people, well, I think that it works like that with statisticians too. They're trained as statisticians, but usually due to their own personal interests, they shift towards a certain area of science, for example, and then they provide their services to that certain type of science. And they also then learn about that certain type of science by talking to researchers who are able to communicate. So I think it's kind of two-way street.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know whether Chris or Lauren would like to pick up on that question at all as well. I don't know if you have rights to unmute yourself. Yeah, it looks like Chris has.
Oh, I was going to say, Lauren, you first. I do.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think everyone should have some knowledge of this to some extent. This is a question I've kind of tossed back and forth for quite a while, thinking, we don't want academics be so reliant on support staff that they can't do these things by themselves, but at the same time, we have to recognize that they're specialists in particular aspects of science, and they need the space and freedom to get on with that job. I do think we also need to be mindful that not every academic will have the benefit of working with support staff like data stewards or research software engineers, and therefore it is quite important to have some training available to researchers wherever they are across the world, whether it's a rich institution or a poor institution, so that they can access the knowledge and kind of materials they need in order to try and make their data fair, so that we don't have a kind of two-tiered system of kind of the wealthier kind of institutions, for example, in Europe, kind of making leaps and bounds ahead with their fair data, and support kind of lacking in other areas. So I think it's important, that we make that knowledge and training available to everybody, but perhaps we can expect support staff to have a greater role in it in certain situations.
Yeah, and I think there's a big role for the kind of community infrastructure and repositories there as well on that side. And Chris?
Yeah, I completely agree with everyone. It's a village again. This common theme, right? we all have to work together and sort of learn together. And I sort of wanted to communicate initially that we actually develop our guidance together, right? I mentioned that before, is that in some ways the way that we sort of teach sometimes is disconnected and not with, our researchers and understanding how they sort of see things and work and sort of tailoring your training and your guidance to that. And I have an example from, I'm copying and pasting it into the chat, but we recently worked with early career researchers in developing R guidance. So how do they make their R scripts, their R markdown, preserved, discoverable, citable. We learned from them. They learned from us, and you should see the Google Doc, and then ultimately it's moved over to GitHub. So that's where that's hosted. But the exchange was so rich of learning from each other about how we can do these things. And the other, I have another example too, which is we often sort of, we say preserve the data, right? But there's increasingly very large data that people need to preserve, and there's really no solution for it, right? Like that unless it comes with costs, and they don't think about this early on. And so we, hearing this in our help desk, working with our researchers on how do we handle this, the large data that you're working with, we put it out transparently and said, how do you work with very large data? This is what we know right now. And you can't necessarily preserve that in a repository at the moment. You can work at your institutional level sometimes. There are some solutions out there, but working together really on those challenges and developing guidance and training is really invaluable.
Yeah, do you want to come in on that, Marta?
I was also wondering, I fully agree with you, Chris, sorry, Sarah, for jumping, about the benefit of collaboration, working together with the research community. And just to, I think connected to the point that Antica mentioned and Lauren about training, I think you need to have, I don't know what was your experience, Chris, but to have these basic skills to be able to enable effective communication between different professionals, And now at our TU Delft Digital Competence Center, when I spoke with our data managers, research software engineers who work with researchers, they often say that it was really important for them, for the interaction with researchers, to actually start speaking the common language, So sometimes training on basic carpentry, for example, really helps to get that, common understanding. But also, sometimes to even know exactly what you need, in a way, as you said, Sarah, in your introductory talk about the technical solutions, we have to work with communities to be able to know them. But what if you can't even name what you need or what you want? So in a way, you need these professionals to be able to help you to find the right thing. But on the other hand, you need to first learn a common language, common concepts that you can communicate. As you said, Antica, and I think, as you said, Chris, about your collaboration, that comes down to training that Lauren has mentioned. So just importance of being able to communicate with one another, to be able to effectively collaborate. And I thought that maybe is important concept to also highlight.
Yeah. And I think that's actually a really important reason to try and co-locate, you know, and have a team, have the different research communities with the support staff, the data stewards and others, so you can really understand each other's practices. You can observe where the bottlenecks are in the different workflows, and then try and think about potential solutions to those, so that you're really understanding each other's perspectives. Yeah, excellent. So we touched a little bit on some of the issues we face in implementing FAIR, and I wanted to come to some of the potential solutions. I know you've touched on some of these already, Chris, but I'm conscious you're working in quite a broad community with AGU, but also in many global initiatives. And I wondered if you have reflections there about solutions that have worked and could be applied more broadly, maybe with other international collaborators or other communities outside of the geosciences.
I'm still stuck on what Marta said about training. I would just want to say I completely agree. She knows I'm a big fan of the carpentries, and before that I was doing data scientist training for librarians, because I think that helped with this communication, right? For those who don't know, I actually I worked for many years in libraries, actually, so I have a library background. But yeah, I think sort of. And this is interesting too, because you brought up astronomy, and that's a place where I worked for a great amount of time too. And now I'm in broader, a broader place now. And I'd say like sort of the common themes, again, coming back to how often I see, the question about repositories in our help desk, right? And that sort of simple step of going to your repository, finding sort of a suitable repository early on can speak wonders later on of sort of helping you structure things, helping you structure your data in a way, and prepare for later on. Also seeing sort of these things of sort of project management, right? And maybe get to this later, but I'm a big fan of Git and GitHub and sort of, I think the concepts, and I know there are other solutions out there like GitLab and Bitbucket. I think I'm just speaking to the concept, right, of Git and sort of the pull request, this sort of handshake of making a change in a sort of open and transparent way and tracking and versioning it. I think that in itself has been sort of a revolutionary thing for me and how I think about things, like how it can sort of save you later on for these questions about tracking your data, like what version of it, can respond to these kind of questions, or, we'll publish this version for this related, publication, and sort of that sort of fundamental sort of project management through sort of that Git management approach has been really helpful for me in thinking how, you can sort of hook into things and take that sort of linked science approach. And I think that's just common throughout research. And you see that in what the carpentries, right, teaches, right? Some of these foundational things that researchers can use in their work. So, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris. We've had a couple of other questions in from the floor, a couple that pick up on ethics, which I'll come to in a moment, but one that I think also picks up on this kind of global communities and connecting the different teams. So there's a comment from FAIR's Fair that they found that a lot of those working in data stewardship teams are often new to the role and work alone or in very small groups. And they wondered about the opportunity to foster the emergence of peer networks, both at the regional and international levels. I know here in the Netherlands, we're very fortunate, actually. Lots of institutions have teams of data stewards, so there's already a small network in the institution. And there's this competence center that's growing up to allow collaboration in different areas. But I wondered if any of you have reflections on how we can give that kind of support network to the people who are fulfilling these roles.
I happy to start if that's okay.
I think you're better placed to answer this question.
It's just, perhaps indeed talking about the communities, my other role, which I'm not representing today, but nonetheless, I think it's relevant. I'm also the director of 40U Research Data, which is a repository for data and software in science, engineering, and design. And exactly that question, about support for data stewards and the peer network came from our partner institutions. They all have appointed their data stewards. And, very often, let's say, if I have a data stewards at the Faculty of Industrial Design Engineering, that's nice that, of course, they have a team of other data stewards at our institutions. But sometimes, wouldn't that make more sense for this person to connect with a data steward serving a similar community at a different university? So indeed, we have appointed a community manager. I'm pleased to say that with our small team, we are a total of maybe 7.5 FTE. We have one dedicated FTE just for community management to also emphasize the effort of that. And indeed, we have started a community of data stewards who are supporting those kind of disciplines for them to enable to get together, to help each other with questions, with the issues that they face. What are the best solutions? What I should recommend to researchers who, for example, would like to make their code reusable in the long term, what they should do, what kind of checklist we can have developed together with the communities. So I do sincerely believe in power of communities in doing that. And I think we should promote together, I think across Europe. I would really dream of a situation. I think organizations such as Research Data Alliance already play a role. But I think we should also stimulate those pockets of communities, in a sustainable manner, of course, across Europe. So I think that's definitely something very much needed. And we saw the benefits of that already.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a role even beyond Europe, internationally through the likes of the Research Data Alliance. Would either of the remote panelists like to come in on that question at all, or shall we move to the sensitive data ones?
I was just going to echo the sentiment about the Research Data Alliance. There are already groups within that network looking at the professionalization of data stewardship. There are, I think, networks beginning to emerge, and it's great that things like the RDA include people from outside of Europe and beyond. So I think, we're starting to see kind of community-led networks springing up.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lauren. So one of the questions we've received in on sensitive data is whether we think European funders and institutions can do more to acknowledge initiatives like care data, to complement FAIR with greater control and involvement from research participants and communities in how their data is used. I don't know if anyone wants to make a reflection on the care principles, how these complement FAIR, and how we, enable communities to kind of govern the use of their data more.
I can jump in first and just say this is a very important matter for us, Indigenous data, and I think that we have a lot of work to do in the community right now because I think this is where we'll head as far as community data, community governance, and having sort of that ownership over data. And I think in some ways we think of things in a monolithic way, right? You go through this process, you go through this, this particular repository and this kind of thing. And I think that we're going to have to sort of pivot here and think about how we give control, how we give ownership, how we let these communities sort of govern how they want to communicate their data and their other resources. And that sort of flexible nature is something that I think, we're looking at, right? We have conversations in our data leadership group, and my colleague Shelley Stahl is deeply involved in this as well, the care principles. But I think it comes back to that sort of concept, right, of Git, and like how you can sort of, manage these things in a flexible way, like how you can sort of let community sort of work together without frictions and have that sort of ownership, have that way of working together to sort of communicate how they want to communicate things, instead of these cases where, I think sort of oftentimes it's communicated at the end and then they find out about data being shared that shouldn't have been shared. So
So picking up on that notion of governance, another question that had actually come in was about the governance of FAIR. This was one of the reflections I made in my talk. And somebody was curious about how the other panelists view that. Is it a little bit top down and at odds with academic culture if we're trying to govern the FAIR principles themselves? Or is this something that we need to do because of the reliance that we have on FAIR?
I think, maybe I can just quickly comment on that. Sarah, we did together this work on how to put FAIR into practice as part of the European Open Science FAIR Working Group. And I think that's, again, we need both, I guess that's a simple answer, but we need that community input. The community decides in the end what's fair for a specific community. Coming back to Antisha, at the point that you have mentioned, that FAIR has to be translated to specific context. And I think this is important. But I think indeed, it is useful to have some sort of oversight and to at least stimulate those discussions within the community. So I think from my quick point, I think both are needed and we can't do it without community involvement.
Yeah, I agree with you completely.
Excellent. Okay. And then another question that had come up was about the role of data stewards. It's something we've touched on a lot in the discussion so far. And they're a fairly new role in terms of research support, but there's a lot of kind of legacy systems of research support within institutions, our colleagues in legal, privacy, ethics offices, also in terms of the grant support and ICT. They also need to be aware of the data management needs. And do we have thoughts about how we can bring these different communities together? I think maybe one reflection from work we did in the UK when we were developing support within institutions through the Digital Curation Centre, we often tried to bring all these teams together to devise the policy, to try and think about the different infrastructure and support that's needed, because often different groups are responsible for different elements in the institution, and it's quite a hard landscape for researchers to navigate. So trying to view it collectively and have a kind of wide support team across the institution was really important.
I really second that, Sarah. Indeed, I do not want to jump on the question again, but indeed we have been working a lot at TU Delft to devise a workflow in which the data steward could be always the first contact point for data questions, not to make it too complicated for researchers. But actually we work at TU Delft with a really huge stakeholder group on many different aspects, and that's from providing support for researchers working with personal data, where we have a workflow that involving different kinds of experts at different stages, starting with a data management plan, so again, at the very beginning of the project, all the way through to thinking about recognition and reward. So I guess, again, you need lots of different kinds of stakeholders to be involved. And I think our main place where we have those discussions, we have an open science program at TU Delft where all those different stakeholders are represented and they do work together, collaborate together on various topics, be it research data management, FAIR software, or skills for open science, or rewards and recognition indeed. And I think that's really important that you see that all those topics are really transversal. And as you said, there is responsibility of different kinds of stakeholders.
And maybe I would add here, now you reminded me, I'm not even sure if this is related to the original question, but I think here cross-pollination between different types of data stewards is needed. Because, for example, some data stewards might be really experts in private data, so data that have these types of kind of considerations. And then in ecology, we have also this type of data, but in a different sense. For example, data on very endangered species, where you also can't really expose them fully because you don't want to, for example, let everybody know where the location is. But we don't have those expertise because we don't know anything about these privacy regulations and similar, and how to protect these data to still make them fair. So I feel it would be really good if there was more communication also between different types of data stewards, and one disciplinary data stewards should talk more and see what one community knows already that other doesn't have to develop again, but just kind of implement what's already there in a different context, but with the same purpose.
Yeah.
Maybe if I can just very quickly add to that, I think, Antisha, what you're saying, again, I think we have to thank our funder at VO for that. But there is also an initiative now started within the Netherlands to launch domain-specific domain-specific digital competence center, where again, the idea is to find whatever best works for certain disciplines and see how can we cross-pollinate this with another, type of researchers discipline, and indeed bring people who share some commonalities with regards to workflows or challenges they experience together to address it in the best manner. So I completely agree with you.
I landed in a session with early career researchers at the European Geophysics Union, and they were saying that they took these sort of data management training courses at organizations, and they were sort of broad reaching, right? They weren't for a particular discipline, and they were sort of commenting on how they needed to be, to have it sort of more discipline specific. So it seems like they're telling us this too, right? Like I at least in one session, and I feel like in other conversations I've had that. But I guess what I want to speak to particularly is that I guess when we come together and we put together these policies, policy documents and other things like that, they are very wordy. and we've gone through at least 2 or 3 iterations so far. And this again comes in where the researchers told us it's too wordy. You need to get to the point in particular spaces, parts of your guidance of like, tell us what is actually needed here. And I think that, that's particularly one area that I'm trying to work on with researchers is get it down to sort of that checklist approach. And it's all right. We can sort of iterate, right? We can move from the most important points that we feel like are important at the moment in particular communities, and in going back to those sort of community standards conversation, then iterate and improve and, work on that. But they only have so much time in the day and focus, right? And they really need things communicated to them succinctly. And so that, that's where we've sort of had a lot of work of going back and forth. And I always think of like how you can sort of make things simple for them, right? And create those sort of hooks that can communicate these things easily.
Yeah, exactly. Some kind of basic profile or wizard that can kind of direct you to the right place. That's kind of easier to digest, because I think there is so much support out there. It's hard to navigate through. One of the questions that came up was really about the phasing of when we bring support in. And it mentions that data stewards often provide support both at the grant application, the proposal phase, and also, again, when data needs to be archived. But what are the most important parts of the FAIR process when this is taking place, and when we need to bring in that specific support to make data interoperable and reusable? So how we kind of bridge the gap in that life cycle and bring support in at the right elements.
I would say,
Marta was holding back.
I would think that my quick reaction to that would be that we should support researchers across the entire research life cycle. Sorry, that's a cliche perhaps, but I think that's, in a way, you need the support at the grant application. You create your DMP, then you need to think about how do you actually implement your DMP, what kind of tools and workflows will you want. How do you connect your different pipelines into ensuring that you have reproducible practices? As you said, Chris, how do we make sure that we work, with data and code in a reproducible manner, ideally using Git, And also, of course, how do you prepare for sharing? But this preparation for sharing has to start at the very beginning, So I would say that this collaboration has to be across the entire research life cycle. So I think, I know that we are not there yet, and we will not be there for the next couple of years. But I would really see if we have those, coming back to this idea of team science, those professionals embedded within research team, research groups, I think that's where the change starts to happen, because really that's something that you consider as an integral part of your research process, not something that just is there at the beginning and at the end, but at different elements, at different aspects during the entire research process.
Yeah, very fluid process.
And maybe I would add to that, because I fully agree with this, there needs to be support from the start to the end, really, because that's how research is done. It's like always something happening. So you can't like abandon the researcher at one point. But the second, I think the role that I see also coming out personal experience is that very often there are no fair data standards for a community. So I think data stewards should also help us to develop community-specific data standards that we can then follow in our data management plan. Because for now, like if I'm developing my data management plan, I will mention something like ecological metadata language, but in practice, it doesn't mean anything because community is specific and it can't really fit into this kind of global language. So I think we need to help to develop our own standards for a bigger community that works with a certain type of data. And I don't see that we really have that. I mean, my example and some other examples, we need that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important part of work to be done still. And actually, there was a question that had come in for you and Tisha about.
Lauren and I had the responses.
sorry.
We're jumping up and down. And
I was looking the wrong way. But go ahead, Chris.
You first, Lauren.
Thanks. No, I just wanted to add that I think that this comes back to the previous question as well around those kind of legacy roles. ICT support and the research kind of grant office that we get in universities, and that we really need to ensure that they're fully incorporated into this data management kind of life cycle as well. And I think the funders have some role that they can play in this. I know from the previous institution I worked at, we were audited by one of our funders, and they, really actually brought the research office who managed the grants together with the library who helped with the data management and kind of really quizzed us on how things like ethics and data management planning all match up with the grant applications and management. And I think that's a really positive step. No one likes being audited, but actually it shows that the funders do care about these types of things and is a way to help kind of change the culture of the collaboration and communication within institutions, which I think is still needed.
Yeah, definitely. And Chris?
Yeah, I just have an example from my library days. So I used to be embedded in the astronomy community, and we heard a lot of this, chatter about credit for software, and I think this goes to like that whole comment about it takes a village and knowing the people, reaching out to certain people to make something happen. But sort of at that time, we worked with various partners in the process. So GitHub and Zenodo and the NASA astrophysics data systems, to really work on that sort of hook, right? Like listening to them and hearing the challenges and working on that hook to give credit to software. So, researchers being able to release their software and get a citation and being able to document that. And I think that's not a perfect solution. And I know that, but I think that's a lesson here too, is that don't let perfect be your enemy here. And that's the name of the game, is that we're iterating. And I think that's been tremendous. You can see on the AGU side, but you could see it in astronomy that software citation exploded, and there's still work to be done, but it started around 2014. And you can see the sort of upward trend of people trying to get credit for their software through that simple mechanism,
Yeah, and on that notion of credit, I'm going to come to this question to Antica about the recognition and rewards. And it's asking, what kind of recognition and rewards for fair data would you like to see as a researcher, both from funders and from institutions?
Well, I think we just need to start implementing DORA and similar already existing agreements, which some institutions have adopted, but are still not really implementing in their work. Because I'm not saying that publication is not something that we should be, involving in the assessment of the researcher, but there are so many other components. That's, for example, contribution to making data fair for your own community, making your data open for others to use it, because you never know what amazing stuff can come of the data that you have collected. So I think they really need to, start to develop new matrices to measure the productiveness and impact of a researcher. I mean, everybody knows that, but it's still kind of underway. And I think a second important thing there is that, when we talk about these kind of ways to measure success, I think we are still in some kind of old-fashioned process that just started ages ago. I don't know even know when, and we're just stuck in it. And even if you're trying to develop something new, we are still impacted too much with what's been there for so long. So I feel somehow like started to feel that recently that we need fresh brains, because even me that I'm like in all of this, I want different ways to assess researchers. I can't come with the good ways to do that. So I really think we need to bring somebody from the outside and say, okay, this is our system. We want to measure the impact in the best sense of impact. How do we do that with all of these products that we have? So I think that would be really good if it could have happened.
Yeah, it will happen. It will change in time, definitely.
It's actually an interesting perspective, if I may say, because indeed you are right that whenever those consultations happen, usually the people who are part of the systems are consulted, and sometimes it's difficult to get out of the box. So I like your idea indeed of thinking about some, external consultation evaluation. If we give those ideas to people, that's really interesting ways of looking at that.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, maybe it's not really related to the topic of FAIR, but it's impacting it all. And that's like the power of the publishers and the money that's involved in all of that. So obviously, there is a large stakeholder who doesn't want to let it go. And I'm sure that is preventing a lot of things. So I guess there needs to be a cut at one point. Cut the cord. And
So we have just about 10 minutes left. So there's a couple of questions that had come in about publishers, which I'll pick up first, and then close with the role of the research funders, given that this is an NWO event. So there's one question here. We all know the story with academic publishing and how universities allowed themselves to be taken over by commercial entities. How can we stop the same happening to FAIR infrastructure? And there's a parallel question about certain publishers like Springer and Elsevier also offering support to researchers in managing and publishing data. And to what extent is this likely to clash with the support offered by research support staff at universities in future? So maybe some reflections from the panelists on the role of publishers, how we kind of navigate between those different support teams, and how we try and keep our FAIR infrastructure open.
Yeah, sure. Lauren, you want to take it first?
No, you go first this time, Chris.
Well, it's interesting because Lauren and I come from, I guess, that library university background, right? And I could say this is an easy question for me within data leadership. We're all about open science, and we, in fact, in some ways, we're working. There's one example with NASA, right? They have an open science initiative, and they're trying to really move things forward, and it won't just move things forward just for NASA. It'll be a big mover for the whole community, but like moving things to the open. And it's sort of like transformational, right? This happens within our society, within the AGU society, and within, our publications. And so I think that's very much a part of what we're thinking about, and because we are the community, at the end of the day, AGU is the community, and we're a society, and we're trying to grow with our community, and I think that I was going to make some other point here too, is that being a librarian again, is that I believe in transparency, and that's already had an impact. I think with how we do things in AGU, I think, it's a message I've been sort of bringing forward is, transparency. And I think we often are sort of, not communicating enough that at AGU, we're doing a whole lot for open access. And I think that, that's very much some of the things that you'll see, of like moving a lot of our research to open. So we, it's very much a thing that we're working on, but we need to get better at that communication side of things, and being transparent, and really working, with our community on this, because I think naturally you can sort of you don't hear that, right? You don't hear these things, and you can it's hard, and then you have to run these studies of what research, what these societies or what these publishers are doing, and you don't hear exactly what they are doing, and you're sort of seeing it from the outside. So we do need to do more work there, and I'm a proponent of that.
Excellent, thanks, Chris. And Lauren, had you wanted to come in too?
Yeah, was just going to come in and kind of echo, I guess, a bit of what Chris is saying, and how we think transparency and openness is important. But and when we partner with infrastructure providers, we aim to try and partner with open non-profit ones who support our mission. But I think we also have to be realistic and about how much these things cost, and that actually to develop some solutions, it doesn't, it can be more expensive, and therefore commercial publishers are more likely to have the money to put into these systems, and that they are more likely to be able to support these infrastructures that researchers need to make things fair. And I think we have to be realistic about things like the cost and where the tension of who pays for that lies. Having been at an institution, I know that there's often a lack of resources and funding for data management support there. Being a non-profit publisher, I know we also have to think carefully about kind of business sustainability, and that we don't want to charge researchers more than we need to when it comes to things like APCs. So I do think there is a role in commercial that kind of more commercial publishers play, but I don't think that it completely replaces the support provided by institutions and services. It might be that the publishers are providing an infrastructure service, but actually they're not necessarily going to be supporting that, providing that day-to-day support that things like the data stewards will be providing, and the training that really kind of underpins fair data.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the role of institutional support is really critical too. So given that we only have a few minutes left, I'd like to come to the question about the role we see for funders, specifically for NWO. Any reflections from a Dutch context here in the panel? And there was also a question to the panel about the role of funders in compliance and monitoring of the uptake of the policy. So potentially that may be part of your response too.
Would you like to get? Yeah, I can start again from researcher's perspective. Well, I think we all reiterated the same thing, and that's that there needs to be change in the way that research is the quality of research and impact of research is recognized, which has started. But what I see is that I think funders, and my experiences with NVO particularly, they also need to pay more attention to how much, for example, grant reviewers and similar people are actually following their guidance. Because I had that experience where something should not have been judged, but it was. So also to ensure that those who are evaluating you are following the guidelines that are given by the funder. And finally, provide more funds to enable fair data, obviously, to employ more data stewards. So is that cutting, from research money already allocated for research, or maybe just putting extra pile of money to hire this type of support staff and enable better training of researchers? I would think that's the really important role they can play in this landscape.
Yeah, and it's good to see how much enablement NWO has already done in those spaces.
I mean, this Open Science Fund is a great thing, and it got some amazing projects funded there. So I think this is also a really good example for other European countries, and I really believe some of them will pick up. So it's also good to be a leader in that sense, to start some new trend, and then others hopefully will follow. Especially when all of these projects are really successful.
And Marta, do you want reflections on the Dutch context?
Thank you, Sarah. Indeed, I think that in the Netherlands, we were quite lucky with the position that NVO has taken, in terms of through the policies, through the actions that NVO took, there was a lot of normalization of RDM on open science. I would say that I wouldn't say that's already business as usual. I don't think we're quite there, but I think we are at that stage where if you don't want to share your data, if you don't want to work openly, you have to explain yourself why. And I think that becomes, questionable practices. And I think that's quite an achievement. So through installing policy, following up on them, I think that's quite a success. And as you said, I will not delve into that, but indeed the incentivizing of research data management of open science practices through initiatives like Open Science Fund, through narrative CV, through indeed trying to recognize and reward different kinds of aspects of research lifecycle. I think it's quite important. I think there's also a room for how can we do better in terms of supporting team science, as we discussed before, and that comes back to what kind of professionals you can hire on your grants for your research groups, for your support, funding for them, and also acknowledging the kind of roles that they are on par to research professionals. And the final thing I wanted to comment also about the funding for infrastructures. I think there was this question that, Sarah, you have read, and reflection from your side before about the publishers sometimes being in the steering wheel of the agenda, you know, how we value researchers and research outputs. And you, Lauren, has mentioned that indeed, you know, there is a bit of difficult competition, you know, that if there is not enough resources to support open science infrastructures. But I think perhaps that's also something, a plea to the funders, you know, to recognize the value of investing and sustaining open source, open science infrastructure. You know, that's something that it's difficult to find funding for, especially in the long term. You know, there are so many projects that, you know, are extremely valuable are funded on a shoestring, you know, project funding ends. And what do we do with all those infrastructures, you know? So I think there is a bit of responsibility there collectively, but also hopefully with the help of our funders.
Yeah, I think it's really important actually for funders to come together and to think about the main infrastructure that needs to be invested in, and doing that, you know, more in alignment so that we can have open infrastructures, we can make sure they're sustainable. Absolutely. So I think that's a key role for NWO and other Dutch funders as we go on. So I would like to just bring us to a close now and say huge thanks to the panelists, to Chris and to Lauren and Tisha and Marta, and particularly to Maria, who's organized this whole event, who's sorted out all of the registrations, and we've got Maria back here. So thank you very much, Maria.
Sarah, thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for all of you who attended today, all of your questions. It's been a really exciting and fascinating discussion. We will now close this session, and as I've explained in the chat, we will move to a different platform for a networking and speed dating session. Those of us here in the studio will actually have to move to another room, so it might take a couple of minutes for us to start the networking session. Please bear with us. For those who cannot join the networking session, thank you very much. For those, and have a good evening or day, as the case may be. And for those who are joining us in the speed dating networking event, we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you everyone. And it's goodbye for now from us here at NVO in The Hague.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us.